The story begins in vibrant African villages, communities with deep roots and traditions, lives connected to land and kin, systems of governance, art and spirituality. Life was their own. Then European ships appeared, signaling a profound change. The demand for labor was immense, fueling the transatlantic slave trade. A brutal system of capture began. Raiders attacked villages, seeking strong men, women and children. The captures were violent and terrifying. Families were torn apart, loved ones watched as relatives were bound, forced to march away from all they knew. The journey to the coast was harsh. Many did not survive. Captives were treated as cargo. Their future was uncertain. The system dehumanized from the start. Identities stripped, freedom stolen, an act of profound violence. After the brutal capture, the journey continued. Captives were marched for days, sometimes weeks. They walked under a harsh sun, often with little food. Chains and ropes bound them together. This prevented escape and asserted control. The destination was the coast, where slave forts stood. These forts were like prisons. Grim and foreboding, they were holding pens for human beings. Here, Africans from different regions were mixed. They spoke different languages, had different customs. Inside these forts, conditions were appalling. Men, women and children were crammed into dungeons. Darkness, disease and despair filled these spaces. The air was thick with suffering and fear. Food was scarce and often of poor quality. Sanitation was non-existent, leading to sickness. Many died before even seeing the slave ships. Their bodies were discarded without ceremony. The captors saw them only as economic units. Profit was the driving force behind this cruelty. The wait in these forts could last for months. Captives endured branding with hot irons. This marked them as property of a trading company. The Middle Passage was the journey across the Atlantic. It was a voyage of unimaginable suffering. Slave ships were designed to carry human cargo. Profit, not comfort, dictated their construction. People were packed into tight, unsanitary spaces. Often, they had less room than a body in a coffin. They were chained together, side by side. Movement was nearly impossible for weeks, even months. The darkness below deck was suffocating. The air was foul with disease and human waste. The conditions on these ships were horrific. Disease spread rapidly in the cramped quarters. Dysentery, smallpox and scurvy were common. Many died from sickness and malnutrition. The bodies of the dead were thrown overboard. Sharks often followed the slave ships. The crews of these ships were often brutal. They used whips and violence to maintain control. Revolts were attempted but usually suppressed. The punishment for resistance was severe. For those who survived, the journey was traumatic. The psychological toll was immense. They were surrounded by death and despair. Upon reaching the Americas, the nightmare continued. The surviving Africans were weak and traumatized. They had endured the horrors of the Middle Passage. Now they faced a new kind of degradation. Before being sold, they were often prepared. This meant washing them and oiling their skin. The aim was to make them look healthier. It was an attempt to fetch a higher price. Scars from whippings were sometimes disguised. This was purely for the benefit of the sellers. The slave auction was a terrifying spectacle. Men, women and children were put on display. They were treated like animals or objects. Buyers inspected them closely, checking their teeth and limbs. Families that had survived the journey together were often separated. Mothers were torn from children, husbands from wives. The cries of anguish filled the auction sites. This was a deliberate strategy to break their spirits. It made them easier to control, or so it was thought. Human beings were reduced to mere commodities. Once sold, they became the legal property of their owners. They were given new names, often European ones. This was another way to erase their identities. Life on the plantations was one of relentless labor. Enslaved people worked from sunrise to sunset. The work was physically demanding and often dangerous. Field hands cultivated crops like sugar, cotton and tobacco. These crops fueled the economies of Europe and the Americas. Overseers used whips and violence to enforce discipline. The threat of punishment was constant. Even small infractions could lead to brutal beatings. There was little respite from the grueling work. Days off were rare and rest was insufficient. Housing conditions were typically very poor. Enslaved people lived in small crowded cabins. These dwellings offered little protection from the elements. Furniture was sparse, often just a mat on the floor. Food rations were basic and often inadequate. Cornmeal and salt pork were common staples. Malnutrition was widespread, weakening their bodies. Clothing was also minimal, often just rags. Disease was rampant due to poor sanitation and nutrition. Medical care, if provided, was rudimentary. Beyond the physical hardships, there was emotional pain. The constant fear and lack of freedom took a heavy toll. Enslaved people had no control over their own lives. They could be sold at any time, separated from loved ones. Resistance to slavery took many forms. It ranged from subtle daily acts to organized revolts. Enslaved people were not passive victims. They actively fought for their freedom and dignity. Day-to-day resistance was common on plantations. This could include working slowly or feigning illness. It might involve breaking tools or damaging crops. These small acts disrupted the plantation economy. They were ways to assert some control over their lives. These actions carried great risk if discovered. Running away was another significant form of resistance. Thousands of enslaved people escaped to freedom. They sought refuge in the north, in Canada, or in maroon communities. Maroon communities were settlements of escaped slaves. These were often located in remote, inaccessible areas. The journey to freedom was perilous. Slave catchers and harsh conditions posed constant threats. The Underground Railroad was a network of secret routes. Abolitionists and allies helped guide fugitives to safety. Harriet Tubman was a famous conductor on this railroad. Armed revolts were less common but very impactful. These uprisings struck fear into the hearts of enslavers. Nat Turner's rebellion in 1831 is a well-known example. Gabriel Prosser and Denmark Vesey also planned major revolts. Despite the horrors of slavery, culture endured. Enslaved Africans brought rich traditions with them. These traditions were adapted and transformed in the Americas. Music was a powerful force for expression and survival. Spirituals, blues and jazz have roots in this period. Songs conveyed sorrow, hope and resistance. Drums, though often banned, found new forms. Rhythms and melodies carried cultural memories. Dance was another vital form of cultural expression. It provided release and maintained community bonds. Storytelling was crucial for preserving heritage. Folktales, often featuring trickster figures, were popular. These stories carried moral lessons and cultural values. They also offered subtle critiques of the slave system. Elders passed down stories to younger generations. This helped maintain a sense of identity and history. Language also adapted, with new Creole languages forming. These languages blended African linguistic elements with European ones. They facilitated communication among diverse groups. Culture became a lifeline in a dehumanizing world. Religion provided solace and strength for many. Enslaved people often blended African spiritual beliefs with Christianity. This created unique and vibrant religious practices. The movement to abolish slavery grew over decades. It involved enslaved people, free blacks and white allies. Abolitionists argued that slavery was morally wrong. They highlighted its brutality and inhumanity. Writers, speakers and activists raised public awareness. Frederick Douglass, an escaped slave, became a powerful orator. His words exposed the realities of slavery. Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin, had a huge impact. It swayed public opinion against slavery. The fight for abolition was long and difficult. Political and economic factors also played a role. The rise of industrialization changed economic needs. Some argued that slave labor was inefficient. International pressure against the slave trade mounted. Britain abolished its slave trade in 1807. It abolished slavery in its colonies in 1833. These actions influenced the movement in other countries. In the United States, tensions over slavery escalated. The country became deeply divided. This division ultimately led to the Civil War. The American Civil War from 1861 to 1865 was a turning point. While initially about preserving the Union, it became a war over slavery. President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. This declared slaves in Confederate states to be free. The abolition of slavery did not erase its impact. Centuries of bondage left deep scars on society. The legacy of slavery is complex and far-reaching. It continues to affect social, economic, and political systems. Racial inequality is one of its most significant legacies. The idea of racial hierarchy used to justify slavery persisted. This led to segregation, discrimination, and systemic racism. These issues continue to be challenges in modern society. Understanding this history is crucial for addressing them. Economically, slavery created vast wealth for some. This wealth was built on unpaid labor and exploitation. It contributed to economic disparities that still exist. Communities of color were denied opportunities for generations. They faced barriers to education, employment, and property ownership. The economic gap created by slavery has been slow to close. This is a structural issue with deep historical roots. Addressing these economic injustices remains a vital task. It requires acknowledging the past and working for change. Culturally, the impact of slavery is also profound. African American culture, forged in resilience, has enriched the world. Music, literature, art, and cuisine bear its influence.